The night shift was almost over, and the lower Wacker subway station held nothing but the groan of the heaters and the scrape of a mop bucket rolling across wet tile when Cora Ballard reached the last row of benches and stopped, because someone was lying slumped across the cold steel, one shoulder pressed into the armrest, a camel hair coat slipping off her back and trailing onto the floor, a coat worth more than 3 months of Cora's wages, now gray with soot. It was an old woman. On her feet were hospital slippers, one of them broken open and lying upside down beneath the bench, her bare toes gone purple with cold. Cora knelt and saw the 4 pale bands across the old woman's fingers, the marks left by rings worn for 40 years and taken off only days ago. Around her wrist was a plastic band printed with a number. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids opened to a narrow slit, clouded, unable to settle on anything, her lips split and white, and it took a long moment before any sound came out at all, thin as paper. "My son, he said he was coming for me." Then her neck went soft, and her head sank against the bench. Cora slid 2 fingers along her throat to find the pulse, that fast, faint pulse of a body that has gone far too long without water, and then she looked at the gray dust that had settled into a fine film across the old woman's shoulder, the kind of dust that only gathers after a great many trains have come and gone. She had been lying on that bench for the better part of a day and a night, and in all that time, thousands of people had walked past her, and not one had stopped, until the woman with the mop, the woman whose own building had never once bothered to ask her name. What Cora could not have known in that moment was that the old woman had not been thrown away at all, that she had ridden 3 separate trains to reach this exact place, and that the son she was waiting for was one of the most powerful men in the city, a man who had spent that entire week believing his mother was resting comfortably at a facility hundreds of miles away. If this story reached you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel, because every story we tell is meant for someone who needs to hear it. Cora called 911 on a phone whose screen was split by 3 long cracks, and while she waited, she took off her uniform jacket and wrapped it around the old woman's bare feet. When the ambulance arrived, 2 paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher as lightly as if they were picking up a bundle of dry firewood. One of them asked Cora if she was family. Cora said no. The other man immediately turned away and asked nothing else. Cora climbed into the ambulance anyway. At the hospital, she sat in the corridor in a uniform still damp with floor water, the legs of her pants carrying the sharp smell of lemon bleach, and every time a door swung open, she looked up. No one called her name, because she had no standing there, no official reason for anyone to call her at all. A nurse passing by glanced at the name embroidered over Cora's chest and told her that the old woman was receiving intravenous fluids, that she was severely dehydrated and hypothermic, and that if she had been left there for one more night, the outcome might have been very different. Cora asked what her name was. The nurse flipped through the paper, clipped to the chart, and read in the flat, practiced voice of someone who had read thousands of forms exactly like it. Female. Estimated age, approximately 75. Next of kin unknown. Lacks cognitive capacity. Cora stared at those words for a long time. There was a woman lying on the other side of that wall, with 4 pale bands around her fingers and a coat worth a fortune, and yet on paper, she had been reduced to a line of description and an empty space where a name was supposed to be. Cora left her phone number with admissions and walked home after daylight had already broken, and for the next 3 days, no one called. On the 3rd day, Cora asked for half a shift off and took 2 buses to the temporary care facility where the hospital had sent the old woman, a low brown brick building on the edge of the city, with clean hallways, shining floors, and the scent of lavender air freshener laid over some other smell underneath. No one stopped her. No one asked who she was. She passed 4 doors standing wide open before she found the room where the woman had been placed. The old woman was lying on her side, facing the wall, the blanket pulled up to her shoulders, her hands folded beneath her cheek, like a child trying to sleep in a strange house. On the small table beside the bed sat an untouched meal tray, its plastic seal still unpeeled, the soup hardened into a flat gray surface. Cora pulled up a chair, sat down, and said softly, "It's me. I'm the one from the train station the other day." The old woman didn't turn around. During the 40 minutes, Cora sat there. 2 employees passed the doorway, one pushing a cart of towels, the other carrying a stack of files, and not one of them came inside. Not one of them said the woman's name. Not one of them spoke a single word to her. Cora suddenly understood that the old woman wasn't lying there facing the wall because she was tired. She was lying that way because there was nothing in that room worth turning around to look at. When Cora reached the reception desk, The woman sitting behind the glass asked who she was, and for the first time in 3 days, someone finally asked that question. Cora said she was the person who had found her. The woman nodded, then explained in a perfectly calm voice that a vehicle would come that weekend to take the old woman to another facility out of state, because this place was only for temporary intake, and cases with no known relatives were always transferred elsewhere. Cora asked where they were sending her. The woman said that information could only be given to family. Cora stood there with one hand still wrapped around the strap of her cloth bag, listening to the low hum of the air conditioner overhead. Then she asked whether there was any way the woman wouldn't have to go. The receptionist opened a drawer, pulled out a pre-printed form, slid it through the slot beneath the glass, and said that if someone volunteered to accept temporary responsibility for her care, the woman could be discharged to that person's residence. All Cora had to do was sign in this box and write her address in that one. Cora held the paper for a very long time. She thought about the rent that was already 2 months late. She thought about the night shift. She thought about her niece sitting at the neighbor's house coloring pictures. Then she thought about the meal tray whose plastic seal no one had bothered to peel away. She placed the form on the counter and signed her name in the slow handwriting of someone who wasn't used to signing official papers. The woman took the form back, stamped it, and turned her eyes toward the computer screen. No one asked where Cora lived, what she did for a living, or where she expected to find the money to support another human being. No one checked anything at all. The whole system had simply been waiting for someone to raise a hand and volunteer to take the thing nobody else wanted, and the moment that hand went up, the system immediately turned away to deal with something else. Ada Fontaine was standing squarely across the second-floor landing, her arms folded over her chest, the key to her storage locker swinging from the cord around her neck. And she didn't need to ask a single question, because she had already seen everything through the hallway window. Had seen the intake facility's car pull up in front of the building, had seen Cora help a silver-haired woman step out. Ada said she had raised 3 children by herself in this building, that she knew exactly how much weight these floors could carry, and these floors couldn't carry one more person. Cora said the old woman had nowhere else to go. Ada told her nobody had anywhere else to go. Nobody in this whole building had anywhere else to go, and that was exactly why a person had to know where to stop. Then she began counting on her fingers, lowering her voice because someone was passing on the stairs. She said the job was the first thing, because the night shift didn't wait for anyone, and that cleaning company replaced workers faster than it replaced mop rags. She said the rent was the second thing, and she knew perfectly well Cora was 2 months behind, because she lived in this building too, and she got the exact same notices. Then she raised a third finger, and held it there for a long time before she said it, that the third thing was the little girl. That if somebody came to inspect this apartment and found an unfamiliar woman with no clear documentation living in a 1-bedroom place with a child, then the name Birdie would end up in some file somewhere, and once a child's name got into a file, it was very hard to get it back out. Cora stood still. Inside her head there was a blank space, and inside that blank space was her sister's face. She said she had paperwork. She had signed it. She was the woman's lawful temporary caregiver. Ada laughed, not mockingly, but with the tired laugh of someone who had been alive longer, and then she said that where they lived, paperwork only meant something when the person holding it had enough money to hire a lawyer. The 2 women looked at each other on the second floor, landing beneath a light fixture with a dead moth trapped inside its plastic cover, and each of them was right in her own way. Cora said the last thing very quietly, that 3 days ago she had seen a meal tray whose plastic covering no one had bothered to peel back, and she couldn't go home and sleep anymore. Then she went up to the 3rd floor and opened the door. On the first night, the old woman got up before dawn, stood in the middle of the living room, with her freshly washed camel hair coat on backward, a neatly folded stack of washcloths held in her arms, and said she had to go home. The dough had been rising since last night, and if it sat too long it would spoil. Cora guided her into a chair, poured her some water, and talked to her about dough, about yeast, about temperature, until the woman finally agreed to put the folded cloths down. On the second night, she got up twice, and both times she called Cora Delia, using the familiar, slightly scolding voice of someone speaking to her own sister, asking whether Delia had locked the back door, asking whether Delia had remembered to turn off the oven. Cora didn't correct her. She said the door was locked, the oven was off, and then she sat on the edge of the bed until the old woman's breathing became even again. Once, sometime in the middle of the night, the woman woke in the darkness and didn't recognize the room, and panic began to take hold of her. She got up and searched for the door, asking, "Why are you keeping me here? I haven't done anything. Let me out." Cora switched on every light, opened the door wide to the hallway so the woman could see that it wasn't locked, then stepped back and didn't touch her until she calmed herself down. The next morning, Cora fell asleep in the plastic chair on the balcony while hanging laundry. She missed the first shift because she had to wait until the woman finished her bowl of porridge, and she missed the second because the woman's slipper slid out from under her at the bathroom door, and Cora spent 2 hours checking every joint and bone in her body before she finally dared to breathe again. When she got home that day, she found a yellow notice taped to the apartment door, the kind of pre-printed paper everyone in the building recognized on sight, and she peeled it off, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into her pocket before Bertie had a chance to see it. On the third night, close to midnight, someone knocked on the door. Ada Fontaine was standing there with her hair wrapped in a scarf, carrying a brand-new air mattress still in its box in one hand and a pot of soup in the other, steam still rising through the cloth wrapped around it. She walked in, set the mattress in the corner, put the soup on the stove, glanced toward where the old woman was sleeping, then checked to make sure the window latch was fastened. She didn't say a single word. Only when she reached the door did she stop, turn her head, and say, "That pot will last 3 days. Don't leave it sitting out." And then she went back down the stairs. Cora stood in the middle of the apartment, listening to the sound of Ada's slippers fading away on the second floor, and for the first time in 3 days, she sat down without having to get right back up. About 7 miles north of Cora's apartment, on the top floor of a building overlooking the frozen river, there was a room that could only be reached by passing through 3 separate doors. And inside that room 4 men sat around a long walnut table, 3 on one side and 1 on the other. The man sitting alone was Rafael Castellano, and everyone in the building called him Rafe, except for the people who weren't close enough to call him that, and those people didn't call him anything at all. He wore a tailored smoke gray suit. No ring, no chain, only a steel watch with a scratched face on his left wrist, the kind of watch that wouldn't bring him even $200 if he laid it on the counter of a pawn shop. In front of him sat a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and a thin file folder. The man across from him was named Perry, the man in charge of logistics at the South Docks. And Perry had been talking for 15 minutes, saying there had been a misunderstanding in the books, that the market had been difficult during the last quarter, that everyone working that side of the business had discrepancies. Rafe didn't interrupt him once. He let Perry keep talking until Perry stopped on his own, and when the room finally fell completely silent, that silence carried more weight than any shouted threat could have. Rafe opened the folder, removed a single sheet of paper, turned it sideways, and slid it gently across the table. Perry looked down. It was a certificate transferring the mortgage loan on the house in Oaklawn, the house where Perry's wife had planted hydrangeas along the front walk, the house where his 2 daughters had grown up. At the bottom, on the line naming the new creditor, was the name of a company Perry knew perfectly well who stood behind. Rafe said only one thing, that he hoped Perry's wife slept well, because she was going to need her strength. Then he closed the folder. Perry had nothing left to say. The 2 men sitting beside him were both nearly 10 years older than Rafe. Both had sat in rooms far worse than this one, and neither of them dared to be the first to stand. They remained still, hands resting on the table, eyes lowered to the wood, waiting until Rafe pushed his chair back and walked to the window. And only then did the sound of chairs scraping across the floor begin. Perry left the room without anyone walking him out. Rafe stood looking down at the frozen river, both hands in his pockets. He never allowed his people to lay hands on anyone, because he had learned very early that a man could heal after a beating, but no one ever truly healed after seeing another person's name written on the ownership papers of his own home. The door opened, and Camille Ashworth stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume and a leather-bound appointment book. She rested a hand on his shoulder and told him she had called the place where his mother was staying that morning, that the weather there was warm and sunny, that his mother had been doing her physical therapy faithfully and eating much better, and that the doctor said they should let her rest for another few weeks before bringing her home, because too much travel wasn't good for someone her age. Rafe asked whether she had mentioned him. Camille said yes. She talked about him all the time. He nodded. He looked at his watch, his father's scratched steel watch, then picked up his coat, because he still had 4 meetings that day, the first one downstairs in 10 minutes. And as he stepped into a hallway covered in carpet so thick it swallowed the sound of his footsteps, 7 miles to the south, in a 3rd-floor apartment with no elevator, his mother was sitting on the edge of a bed with a neatly folded stack of washcloths in her arms, explaining to a strange woman that she had to go home because the dough had been rising since the night before. There were things Cora had thought she had forgotten completely, since dropping out of nursing school halfway through her second year, and yet they were still there, waiting quietly until there was some reason to use them again. The first thing she did was unscrew the cold white bulb from the living room ceiling and trade it for a warm yellow one at the corner grocery store, because white light broke shadows into sharp angles across the walls, and to someone who was confused, a broken shadow could look no different from a stranger standing inside the house. The second thing she did was buy a large-faced wall clock with thick black hands and bold numbers and hang it directly across from the place where the old woman usually sat, and beneath it, Cora taped a handwritten note telling her what day of the week it was. The third thing didn't cost a cent, and it was the most important of all. Every time Cora was about to touch her, she said the woman's name first, stood where she could be seen face to face, and only then reached out her hand. And she never argued with her. When the woman said the dough had been rising since the night before, Cora didn't tell her there wasn't any dough. She said the dough was somewhere cool and they would check it again in the morning. When she asked whether Delia had locked the back door, Cora said yes, it was locked. There was one rule Cora remembered learning from an older instructor at school, that you couldn't argue with fog. You could only walk beside it until it lifted. By the fifth night, the old woman had begun sleeping straight through until morning. By the seventh, she was sitting up on her own to make tea, and she complained that Cora brewed hers too strong. That afternoon, Bertie came home from school, tossed her backpack onto a chair, and pulled an old deck of cards from a drawer, the deck that was missing the 7 of diamonds, and had replaced it with a hand-drawn piece of cardboard. The little girl pulled up a chair, arranged the table, and dealt the cards with all the seriousness of a professional dealer, then explained the rules in the solemn voice of a 6-year-old, describing something of tremendous importance. The old woman listened to every word, nodded, and then won 3 games in a row. On the third game, when she laid down her final card, and Bertie let out a loud cry of disappointment, the old woman tipped her head back and laughed out loud. It was the first laugh that had sounded through that apartment since she crossed the threshold. A rough laugh, very brief, but full and weighty, the kind of laugh that belonged to a woman who had laughed a great deal in her lifetime. Cora was standing at the sink with both hands still submerged in soapy water, and for a moment she had to remain perfectly still. Bertie demanded another game, lost again, then dissolved into giggles, then ran off to find paper and a pencil so she could keep score for both sides. The next morning, Cora was mopping the kitchen floor before leaving for work when she heard the old woman speak behind her, and her voice was completely different, no longer wandering, no longer searching for words, but sharp and clean like scissors cutting cloth. She said, "You're dusting that floor, not mopping it." Cora turned around. The old woman pushed herself to her feet, walked over, took the rag from Cora's hand, lowered herself onto one knee on the tile, and showed her how it was done, pulling one long stroke, pressing down through the wrist, then making another stroke that overlapped half the first. She said you had to overlap the edges like this or you would leave strips untouched, and you had to work backward instead of forward so you didn't step on the part you had just cleaned. Then she added, very softly, almost as though speaking to herself, "My mother cleaned the hallways in those buildings on Dearborn Street for 20 years. This is how she did it." Cora asked what her mother's name was. The old woman looked up, and for the space of a single breath, Cora saw those eyes become bright and clear, focused, an entire person looking out from somewhere behind them. Then the clarity faded. The old woman looked down at the rag in her hand as though she couldn't understand why it was there, and then she asked Cora whether it was time to go meet the car yet, without saying which car she meant. The plastic wristband was still fastened around the old woman's wrist. Cora hadn't cut it off because she thought it might still be needed. And that night, after the woman had fallen asleep and Bertie had gone to bed, Cora sat down on the edge of the chair, beneath the warm yellow light, and gently turned the band until the faintly embossed sequence faced upward. There were 13 characters, divided into 3 groups, and the first group consisted of 4 letters. She typed the sequence into her cracked screen phone and spent nearly an hour working her way through lookup pages until the first 4 letters matched the registration code of a nursing facility in Indiana, more than 100 miles southeast of the city, a place with a name that sounded gentle, with a photograph of its front entrance taken in summer, flower beds in bloom and white wicker chairs arranged outside. Cora sat staring at that photograph for a long time. Then she thought about the vehicle. The old woman couldn't have walked 100 miles, so some kind of transport had to have taken her away from that place. And if there had been a vehicle, there had to have been a stop. The next morning, after her night shift, instead of going home, Cora took a bus to the interstate stop on the southern edge of the city, the station where every route coming in from Indiana had to stop for fuel. She brought along the photograph Bertie had taken of the old woman on her phone the day they played cards, the photograph where she was laughing. The man working the daytime counter didn't remember anything, but the night clerk did, and he remembered because of the coat. He said that at this station, people either wore puffer jackets or uniforms, and nobody ever showed up in a camel hair coat like that. So he had looked twice. Cora asked who the old woman had been traveling with. The man said no one. She had been alone. He took Cora into the back room, pulled up the archived security footage, and rewound it. And Cora saw it. The old woman stepped down from the white transport van by herself, with no one helping her and no one beside her, one hand gripping the door frame, the other holding a small cloth bag against her body. She paused on the sidewalk for several breaths, looked up at the directional sign, then turned left. No hesitation, no looking back, no asking anyone a single question. The night clerk said the vehicle had stayed there for about half an hour, that the driver had gone inside to buy coffee, and that when he came back out, apparently he hadn't counted his passengers again. Cora asked whether anyone had reported a missing person. The man shrugged and said that if someone had, the police would have come asking questions, and nobody ever had. From that station, Cora kept following the trail. She walked in the exact direction the old woman had turned, and after about 4 blocks, she reached a suburban train station. The ticket attendant there didn't remember her, but the cameras did. The old woman stood on the platform, read the electronic board, then boarded the correct train toward downtown. At the first transfer station, she got off, walked through the connecting tunnel, and boarded another line. At the second transfer station, she got off again and transferred again, this time to the line that looped beneath the city. 3 train lines, 2 transfers, and not one wrong leg of the journey. Cora sat on the plastic bench at the suburban platform, still holding the phone in her hand, and felt a chill move down her spine that had nothing to do with winter, because she understood exactly what she had just seen. A woman who couldn't remember what day of the week it was. A woman who called Cora by the name of a sister who had been dead for years. A woman who sometimes couldn't even recognize the room she was standing in. That woman couldn't read an electronic schedule on her own, couldn't choose the right line, couldn't make 2 consecutive transfers without missing a single connection. Nobody could do that, unless that route wasn't stored in the part of her memory that had been damaged. Unless she had been going somewhere she remembered more clearly than her own name, somewhere her feet had learned by heart, long before her mind began losing pieces of itself. That night, Cora opened the train map on her phone and zoomed in on Lower Wacker Station, the station whose floors she had cleaned for 7 years, the station where she had found the old woman. She dragged her finger slightly north, then she stopped. Lower Wacker Station was exactly 1 block from the building on Dearborn Street. The old woman hadn't wandered there by accident. She had gone there on purpose, and she had collapsed only on the final stretch, when she was less than 200 steps from where she had been trying to go. That weekend, Cora took out the camel hair coat to mend the tear along the hem, because the weather was still cold, and it was the only coat the old woman had. When she turned it inside out, she found that 1 corner of the silk lining had come unstitched, and in the space between the lining and the outer fabric, several things had slipped down and been trapped there for a long time. She pulled out 3 empty pieces of aluminum blister packaging, a small piece of paper folded into quarters and softened by dampness, and a button that didn't belong to the coat. Cora sat down on the floor and spread the 3 pieces of blister packaging across her lap. Each one still bore the name of the medication, the name of the dispensing facility, and the name of the person for whom it had been prescribed. She read that name twice. Then she read the 3 dosage instructions, and she sat very still for a long time. 2 years of nursing school weren't enough to make her a doctor, but they were enough for her to know that 3 medications like these weren't supposed to be prescribed on top of one another, and certainly not at those doses for a woman who weighed only a little more than 90 pounds. That evening, Ada came upstairs to collect her pot, and Cora laid the 3 pieces of blister packaging on the kitchen table, beneath the warm yellow light. Ada put on her glasses, held each piece up to examine it, then asked what that was supposed to mean. Cora told her to think about how quickly the old woman had improved since coming there. Ada nodded and said anybody could see it. On the first day, she could barely sit upright. Cora said exactly, and that was what didn't make sense. Then she explained it slowly, using the very same words an older instructor at nursing school had used to teach her years before. She said human memory wasn't one storage room. It was many storage rooms stacked one beneath another, and that disease ate its way down from the top. It took the newest room first, the one that held what you ate today, Who called a few minutes ago, where you had just put your keys. Then it worked its way downward, and the deepest room, the one holding the things repeated again and again through the first decades of a person's life, was the last one it reached. That was why the old woman couldn't remember what day of the week it was, but still knew that when you mopped a floor you had to overlap each pass and work backward. And it was also why her feet knew 3 train lines by heart. Her illness was real, Cora said. Nobody could invent something like that, and it would never go away. But a real disease moved slowly. It took one step at a time, year after year. What Cora had seen at the train station wasn't a woman walking down those steps one by one. It was someone being pushed underwater. Ada took off her glasses and set them on the table. Cora went on. When someone was pushed under like that, every distracted moment became disorientation on paper. Every time she used the wrong name became failure to recognize family. Every spell of drowsiness became unresponsiveness. And after only a few months, there would be a thick file proving that this woman was no longer capable of making a single decision about her own life. The disease made her forget, but someone had turned that forgetting into paperwork. Ada sat silently for a while, then asked who had done it. Cora said she didn't know yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Whoever had done it had to be someone with the authority to sign on the woman's behalf. Someone close enough to her for long enough to place every pill directly into her hand, and someone she trusted. At that same moment, 7 miles to the north, in a dining room with a high ceiling and a long table, Auguste Castellano was pouring more wine into his younger brother's glass. He was telling the story of when the 2 brothers were boys, the time Rafe had sneaked down into the bakery basement and fallen asleep inside a sack of flour, while the whole family searched for him through the night. And Auguste told it so well that Camille laughed out loud. Rafe laughed too. Auguste raised his glass and said their mother had always loved the youngest one more. Everybody knew that, and he said it in the cheerful voice of an older brother who had made peace with that truth a long time ago. His hand rested steadily against the stem of the wineglass, his nails trimmed short and clean, without a mark anywhere on them. That morning, Cora woke earlier than usual because she heard water running in the bathroom, and when she stepped out, the old woman was already standing in the kitchen, her hair combed back and secured with the plastic clip Bertie had lent her, every button on her cardigan fastened, both hands resting on the back of a chair. She wasn't staring vaguely out the window the way she did most mornings. She was looking directly at Cora, and there was focus in those eyes. There was weight. There was an entire person standing behind them. She asked what Cora's real name was, not the name embroidered on her uniform. Cora stopped in the middle of the walkway, still holding a washcloth in one hand, and told her. The old woman nodded, pulled out the chair, sat down, and told Cora to sit across from her, because she didn't know how much longer she had, and she didn't want to waste a single minute. Then she began to tell her. She said her name was Rosalind Castellano, that she had been born in a steel town called Renwick, that her mother had spent 20 years cleaning the hallways of buildings on Dearborn Street, and that Rosalind had grown up in the waiting rooms of those buildings, sleeping in armchairs while her mother dragged a mop down the corridors. She said she married at 20, a man named Salvatore, and together they opened their first bakery with money borrowed from 3 neighbors, a little from each one, repaying the debt in bread and pastries throughout the first 2 years. She said she had risen before dawn for 40 years, and she pointed to both wrists, where old burn scars had faded to a cloudy white, and told Cora those were the marks left by 40 years of pulling trays from ovens. Salvatore died before their youngest son had even finished high school. She said she had 2 sons. The older one was named August, the younger one Raphael, 9 years apart. And she said those 9 years between them had damaged more things than she had ever imagined they could. She told Cora that one bakery became 3, then there were warehouses, then factories, then things she stopped asking about because she knew no one would tell her the truth anyway. She said that when everything was reorganized into a corporation, the ownership was divided, and her share was 41% of the voting rights, held in her own name, not because she wanted power, but because Salvatore had told her that as long as she held it, neither of their sons would be able to swallow the other whole. She was silent for a while. Then she spoke about August. She said her oldest son was a good son. He stayed close. He had dinner with her every week. He took her to her appointments. He remembered her birthday. He was the only person in the family who knew she liked her tea weak. And because of that, he had the key to her house, her passwords, her power of attorney, and the phone numbers of every doctor she had. She said that one evening, she had been looking for her reading glasses and opened the wrong drawer in his desk, and inside she found a notebook. In that notebook, written in her son's steady handwriting, was a record of every time she had forgotten something. On this date, she called the housekeeper by the wrong name. On this date, she let a pot boil dry. On this date, she asked the same question 3 times during dinner. On this date, she couldn't remember where she had gone the day before. There was a column for the date, a column for what happened, and a column for who had witnessed it. That notebook had been growing thicker for 3 years. She said she stood in her son's office with the notebook in her hands and understood that people didn't keep records like that out of love. They kept records like that because they intended to put them in front of a judge. Cora asked whether she had told anyone. The old woman gave a faint laugh, so thin it was almost nothing, and said, "Told who? If I told the younger one, he was busy, and after I finished talking, he would only pick up the phone and call his brother. If I told the doctor was paid by the older one. If I told the neighbors, I had moved away from that neighborhood years ago." She said that when people grew old and began to forget, everything they said was heard as a symptom instead of being heard as testimony. That was the worst part, she said. Not the forgetting itself, but the fact that from the moment people knew you forgot things, nobody believed your words anymore. Then she placed both hands flat on the table, all 10 fingers marked by 4 pale white bands, and said the last thing in a voice that was perfectly calm. She said, "I hid something. I hid it back when I could still remember clearly. I hid it the night I closed that notebook and put it back into the drawer. Because right then, I knew there would come a day when I wouldn't be able to protect myself anymore. And I didn't want to leave it with a lawyer. And I didn't want to leave it with either of my sons. I left it for myself. I hid it somewhere no one in that house had ever once set foot." The old woman gave her the address, and Cora set her cup down on the table harder than she meant to. It was the building on Dearborn Street. It was the building where Cora had cleaned 9 floors for 7 years, 3 nights a week. The building where she knew every place the carpet had begun to peel at the edges and every loose electrical outlet. The 2 women went there that very afternoon, while the old woman was still clear-headed, because Cora didn't dare wait until morning. They didn't enter through the main lobby, where there was a stone reception desk and 2 security guards in suits. They went around to the alley behind the building, to the gray-painted steel door used for deliveries. The door Cora pushed open every night with her left shoulder, because one of its hinges sagged. She swiped her employee card. No one looked up. People didn't look at a woman in a cleaning uniform, walking through a service entrance with an old woman beside her, any more than they looked at a mop standing in the corner. The freight elevator shuddered and descended to the basement, and when the doors opened, Rosalind Castellano stepped out first, without needing anyone to show her the way. She walked past the row of insulated pipes, turned left at the old fire hose connection, and stopped in front of a wooden door whose number had worn away until none of the lettering remained. It was the janitorial supply room. Cora had been inside that room thousands of times to fetch buckets, dump dirty water, and hang rags on the line. The old woman stood in the middle of the room and slowly turned in a circle, as though allowing her body to remember, then walked toward the wall behind the shelving where the cleaning bottles were kept, to the place where several sheets of pressed wood paneling had rotted along the bottom from years of dampness. She said the 3rd panel from the corner. Cora pulled the shelving away, slipped her fingers into the gap, and the panel came loose more easily than she expected, because its nails had been removed long ago, and it was held in place only by 2 hooks. Behind it was a hollow space in the wall, about a handspan deep. Inside that hollow sat a rectangular tin box, the kind that once held butter cookies, and was often given as a holiday gift, its lid printed with a windmill whose paint had begun to flake away. Cora lifted it out and set it on the bottom of an overturned plastic trash can. The old woman opened the lid with her own hands. Everything inside had been arranged in careful order, the way someone would arrange it while still completely lucid. On top was a bundle of embossed documents, the original certificates of share ownership in her name, with the percentage written both in words and in numerals. Beneath those was a sealed envelope containing her will, the edge of the envelope bearing her signature across the flap. Beneath that was a memory card no larger than the tip of her little finger, wrapped in a piece of aluminum foil and secured with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. And at the very bottom, lying flat against the base of the tin, was a thick notebook bound in moss-green cloth, all 4 corners worn bare. Old, far older than anything else in the box. Cora opened it. Inside were columns drawn by hand, 1 line for each day, recording the time a shift began, the time it ended, the number of floors, and the wages earned. The handwriting leaned slightly to one side, slow and deliberate, first written in pencil and then traced over in ink. On the first page was the name of a woman Cora had never heard before. The old woman laid her hand on that page and said it was her mother's time book, kept for 20 years, kept inside this very building, less than 30 steps from where they were standing now. Then she added, very softly, that the Castellano family had 3 generations of men, and not one of them had ever once set foot down here. When Cora lifted the cloth-bound notebook from the bottom of the tin, there was something else underneath it, so thin that at first she thought it was just a sheet of lining paper. It was a small photograph with scalloped edges, faded to the color of weak tea. In it, 2 women stood in front of the freight elevator, both wearing the same style of janitorial uniform, aprons tied around their waists, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The woman on the left was shorter, her hair pinned up high, one hand resting on the handle of a broom, her face stern in the way of someone who had been told to pose for a picture and didn't like it. The woman on the right was taller, smiling broadly, one arm wrapped around the other woman's shoulders. Behind them was the freight elevator door with its iron lattice gate pulled across, the same door Cora had stepped through 10 minutes earlier, except that in the photograph it was still new, and the paint hadn't begun to wear away. The old woman held out her hand for the photograph. She took it, moved it a little farther away until it came into focus, then placed one finger on the woman to the left and said, "This is my mother." Cora nodded. Then the old woman moved her finger to the woman on the right, and she said nothing at all. She simply handed the photograph back to Cora and turned it over. On the back, written in pencil that had almost completely faded, were 2 names. The first was the name Cora had just seen on the opening page of the time book. The second was Wilhelmina Ballard. Cora stood perfectly still. Inside that janitorial supply room, the only sound was the low machinery of a water pump running somewhere behind the wall, and the smell of lemon bleach was so familiar to her that she no longer noticed it. She looked down at the taller woman in the photograph, at the way she smiled, at the slight lift of her chin, and she realized she had seen that expression before. She had seen it in her mother's wedding photograph, the one that had hung on the bedroom wall throughout Cora's childhood, the picture with an old woman seated in the front row, wearing a flowered dress, and smiling in exactly that way. Cora's grandmother had died when Cora was too young to remember the sound of her voice, and no one in the family had ever said much about her. They only said she worked nights, that she took the streetcar to work, that she died from her lungs. No one had ever said where she worked. Cora didn't ask another question. She sat down on the overturned plastic bin with the photograph resting between both hands, and she stayed that way for a very long time. The old woman let her sit. Then, she pulled the room's only plastic chair closer and sat down across from her, their knees nearly touching, and she began to speak in the voice of someone who knew she was spending the last few coins left in her pocket. She said that on the night she had been lying on the bench and someone knelt beside her, she hadn't been able to see that person's face, because by then her eyes could make out little more than light and darkness. But she had seen the name embroidered on the woman's chest, because it had been directly in front of her, only about a handspan away, stitched in raised white thread against blue fabric. She said she had read that last name, and in that moment, the name Ballard had pulled her back from somewhere very deep, pulled her all the way back to the waiting room on the ground floor of this very building, where she used to sleep in armchairs while her mother dragged a mop down the hallways, and where another woman sometimes sat beside her, covered her feet with a coat, and asked whether the little girl was hungry. She said she had heard that name throughout her entire childhood. Cora looked up. The old woman continued, more slowly now, saying there was something she had owed the Ballard family for decades, something no one had ever told again, and she had intended to carry it with her to the grave because she thought there was no one left to tell, until the night she read that name on the chest of a woman kneeling on the floor of a subway station. Cora asked what it was. The old woman placed a hand on Cora's knee, and that hand was so light it seemed to have almost no weight at all. She said, "Leave that story for now. I'm not strong enough today." Then she looked around the janitorial supply room, at the rows of bottles on the shelves and the misshapen plastic bucket standing in the corner, and she said she had taken 3 trains to get back here, and she had only fallen on the very last stretch. Then she added, almost smiling, "But maybe it was a good thing I fell, because if I had managed another 200 steps, I would have reached this tin box, but I never would have met the person I needed to meet." What finally broke everything open wasn't a camera, and it wasn't a witness. It was a health insurance card. Cora had used it at a community clinic on the south side of the city to get blood pressure medication for the old woman, because she had found it in the inside pocket of the camel hair coat and had simply thought that whoever the card belonged to was the person who should use it. Wesley Corrigan placed a printout of that transaction on Rafe's desk one morning, and he didn't say anything else. He simply left the paper there until Rafe saw the line with the name on it. Rafe read that name, then read the address of the clinic, and he didn't speak for so long that Wesley had to shift his weight from one foot to the other. Then he asked what the nearest place was to that clinic. Wesley answered. Rafe reached for his coat. 3 nights later, just as Cora's shift ended, and she stepped through the steel door into the alley behind the Dearborn Street building, her shoulder still aching from pushing it open, a black sports utility vehicle was parked across the mouth of the alley, blocking the way out, its lights off, its engine still running, exhaust curling from the tailpipe in a white ribbon through the cold air. The rear door opened. A broad-shouldered man stepped out, moved aside, and held the door open without saying anything, giving only the slightest tilt of his head. Cora looked around. The alley was about 30 paces long, and there was a wall at the far end. She could turn around and push her way back inside. But that door could only be opened from the interior. She walked over and climbed into the back seat. The inside of the vehicle was warm and dark, carrying the smell of leather and the faintest trace of wood. The man sitting on the other side didn't turn to look at her. He wore a smoke-gray suit, no ring, and on his left wrist was a steel watch with a scratched face. A watch that didn't belong at all with everything else around him. He said the old woman's name. It wasn't a question. He simply spoke it, as though setting something heavy down between them. Cora said yes. She's staying with me. He asked since when. She said since the night I found her at the train station. He asked whether she had said anything. Cora understood immediately that this was the real question, and she said she had said many things. Some clearly, some not. The man gave one very small nod. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a check, and placed it on the leather seat between them, face up, setting a pen beside it. The check had already been signed in the lower corner. The amount line was blank. He told her to write in a number, and then forget she had ever seen the woman. Cora looked at the check. She thought about the yellow notice she had peeled from her apartment door and stuffed into her pocket. She thought about 2 months of unpaid rent. She thought about the winter shoes Bertie had already outgrown before Thanksgiving. She thought about all of those things in the time it took her to let out a single breath. Then she pushed the check back toward him, slowly, using 2 fingers. She said the woman drank weak tea, and if you made it too strong, she complained. She said the woman was frightened by white light because it broke shadows into sharp shapes against the walls and made her think strangers were standing inside the apartment. So I changed the bulb to a warm yellow one. She said she couldn't remember what day of the week it was, but she remembered that when you mopped a floor, you had to overlap each pass and work backward. She misses her sister Delia, and some nights she called me by that name. Then Cora lifted her eyes and looked directly at the man sitting beside her. A man almost no one in the entire city dared to look at for more than 3 seconds. And she said, "If you knew any of those things, I wouldn't have had to be sitting here." The vehicle went silent. Outside, a garbage truck passed the mouth of the alley, its hydraulic system whining sharply before falling quiet again. Rafael Castellano looked down at the check lying on the seat, the check no one in his entire life had ever pushed back toward him, and he didn't pick it up. The SUV followed Cora's bus all the way home, and when she got off at the familiar corner, it pulled over about 30 feet away, shut off its engine, and then the door opened. Cora walked ahead without looking back, and the man followed her alone, because Wesley had been told to stay in the vehicle. The building had no elevator. The stairwell was narrow, the handrail painted brown with whole patches peeling away, and on the second-floor landing the dead moth was still trapped inside the light cover. Rafe climbed 3 flights in his smoke-gray suit and thin leather shoes, and when he reached the top, he had to lower his head to pass through the doorway, because that frame had been built for people from another time. Cora unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped aside. Inside, the warm yellow light was on. Beneath the large-faced clock on the wall was the handwritten note, saying what day of the week it was. On the kitchen table sat Ada's pot of soup, with the lid still on. The deck of cards missing the 7 of diamonds stacked neatly beside it, and the score sheet Bertie had drawn in colored pencil with 2 columns, one bearing the old woman's name, and the other the little girl's. With the old woman's column far ahead, the kitchen floor was covered in white ceramic tile, and 3 tiles had chipped corners, damage left by the previous tenant, and every time Cora mopped around them, she had to turn the rag so it wouldn't catch. Rafael Castellano stood in the middle of that kitchen, and he didn't know what to do with his hands. The old woman was sitting in the chair beside the window, a thin blanket spread across her knees, the moss-green cloth-bound notebook in her hands, though she wasn't reading it. It simply lay open in her lap, and every so often she smoothed the page with the back of her hand. It was a foggy day for her. Since morning, she had asked Cora 3 times whether it was time for the car to come. She looked up when someone's shadow blocked the light from the doorway. She looked at the tall man standing in the kitchen, at his suit, at his shoes, and there was nothing in her face. No fear, no joy, no recognition. She looked at him exactly the way someone might look at a plumber who had come to fix a pipe. Then she turned back toward the window and asked whether it was raining outside because she hadn't brought in the laundry. Rafe couldn't answer. He stood there with his arms hanging at his sides, and Cora saw his jaw move once. He stepped forward very slowly, then sat down in the chair across from her, the plastic chair Bertie usually used when she dealt the cards, and it was so low that his knees rose almost to his chest. He said something very softly, something only she could hear. The old woman tilted her head politely, the way someone listens to a stranger making conversation about the weather. He said something else. She smiled, nodded, and didn't answer. He lifted one hand as though he meant to touch hers, then stopped halfway, because suddenly he remembered that he hadn't said her name first, and he had heard Cora explain that in the car. He drew his hand back and rested it on his knee, and it was at the exact moment that hand lowered, palm facing upward against the gray fabric of his trousers, that the old woman saw it. She stared for a long time. She stared at the thin scar running along the inside of his left wrist, the scar he had carried since he was very small, from the day he climbed onto the ledge beside the oven trying to reach a tray and his hand slipped. She looked at that scar, then reached out and laid her hand over it, and she called him by a name. Not Raphael, not Rafe. It was the name she had given him when he was 4 years old, the name only she ever used, and only in the kitchen behind the bakery when the two of them woke before the rest of the town. A ridiculous little name that had nothing at all to do with his real one. A name no other living person in the world knew except her. She called him that, and then she said, "You've been reaching into the oven again, haven't you?" The man no one in the entire city dared to look at for more than 3 seconds slid off the plastic chair and dropped to his knees on the white-tiled floor between those 3 chip tiles, wrapping both arms around the old woman's knees and pressing his forehead against the thin blanket covering them. His smoke-gray suit folded into deep wrinkles across his back and elbows. The old woman didn't understand what was happening. She looked down at the head, bowed in her lap, slightly bewildered, then raised the hand, marked by 4 pale white bands, and began stroking his hair, slowly, steadily, in the same rhythm someone might use to comfort a child who didn't even know why he was crying. Cora stepped backward into the hallway and pulled the door almost closed, leaving only a narrow opening. She stood outside with her back against the wall, and from inside the kitchen she heard a very small sound, the sound of a grown man trying not to break, and failing. It took Wesley Corrigan 4 days to trace the white medical transport van, and when he walked into the office on the upper floor with a file tucked beneath one arm, there was something in his face that Rafe had never seen in all the years they had worked together. Wesley set the file on the desk and said he should read it himself, because if Wesley tried to say it out loud, no one would believe him. Rafe opened it. The first page was the operating license of a small medical transportation company registered in Indiana, with a fleet of 4 vehicles. The second page listed the company's shareholders, and the sole shareholder was a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The third page listed the members of that Delaware company, and the only member was another legal entity. Rafe turned the page. The fourth page. He stopped on the 4th page for a very long time. At the bottom of those 3 layers of corporate shells, the thing that ultimately owned everything was a trust bearing his family's name, the same trust Rafe himself had established years earlier to hold the parts of his operations no one needed to see. The trust he had deliberately designed so no government agency could trace its way back through it. No newspaper could dig it up. No one could reach it. The company that had carried his mother out of the city was being paid with his own money, Wesley continued, because he knew that if he stopped now, he might not be able to start again. He said he had recovered every recording from the weekly calls August had been sending over. The recordings Rafe listened to every Sunday night in the car on his way home. The ones where the old woman rambled, repeated the same question, talked about breakfast, asked whether her youngest son had been eating properly lately. Wesley said he had given the recordings to someone who knew what to look for, and that person discovered that every one of them had been edited together from older recordings. Some had been taken from the same conversation and split into 3 separate weekly messages. In one of them, you could still hear the chime of the grandfather clock from a house she no longer lived in. Rafe had never suspected anything, because a confused woman wandering through a conversation seemed perfectly natural, and because he had listened to those recordings while driving, while exhausted, while his mind was still trapped inside the 4 meetings he had just finished. Wesley placed one more sheet of paper on the desk. It was a payment statement. The fees for the out-of-state nursing facility had continued to be paid every month without a single missed payment, drawn from the family account, confirmed. Each transfer carrying its own transaction code. They were still paying for an empty room. Rafe sat down. He didn't ask why. He knew why. He simply sat there and looked through the window at the frozen river below. And he thought about every layer of protection he had built around his mother over all those years. He had bought her a house where unfamiliar vehicles couldn't get through the gate. He had hired 3 caregivers and paid them twice the market rate, so they would never have a reason to leave. He had arranged a private doctor, a private car, a private driver. He had built a wall no one from the outside could penetrate. And he had built it so well that when everything happened, there was no one on the outside who could see in anymore. That wall had only one door, and he had given the key to his brother, the man who had dinner with him every week, the only person in Rafe's life he had never once checked behind. Wesley asked what he wanted to do. Rafe didn't answer right away. He took hold of the scratched steel watch on his left wrist and turned it once around his arm. Then he said, "I built all of this so no one could touch her, and then I handed them the key with my own hands." He said it very calmly. Wesley stood perfectly still, and he was more afraid than he had ever been during all the times Rafe had raised his voice, combined. 2 days later, Cora was invited to the office on the upper floor, this time through the main entrance, and the person at the reception desk stood up when she walked in, something that had never happened to her in 7 years of passing through buildings like this one. Rafe spread the entire file across the walnut table and hid nothing, because he had decided that if he wanted this woman standing on the same side as him, then she had to see everything. He showed her the 3 layers of corporate shells, showed her the trust at the bottom, and while he was talking, Cora turned to the pages behind them, the pages listing the other entities held beneath that same trust, a long list printed in 2 columns in small type. She skimmed it, then stopped. Her finger came to rest on a line halfway down the right-hand column. She read it 3 times. Rafe saw her hand stop moving and asked what was wrong. Cora didn't answer immediately. The name on that line belonged to a private emergency services coordination company, the company that controlled ambulance routing for the entire Bridgeport district, the same name she had written again and again in 3 formal complaints sent to the city over 3 straight years, none of which had ever received an answer. She said her sister's name. She said Nell Ballard, and then she told him about that afternoon, when her sister collapsed on the kitchen floor of their 3rd-floor apartment, when Cora called 911 on a phone whose screen hadn't even cracked yet, and the dispatcher told her an ambulance was coming. And then she sat on the floor holding her sister's head for nearly an hour while she waited. She said that afterward she had gone asking questions, and people had explained to her in very polite words that the neighborhood was classified as low priority, that resources were limited, that the system allocated service according to data. She said she hadn't understood what that sentence truly meant for 3 years, not until today. The room fell silent. Wesley stood in the corner, and he didn't look at anyone. Rafe said he didn't know that company's name. Cora said, "I believe you." Then she asked Wesley, not Rafe, whether nearly all emergency services on the south side of the city passed through their network. Wesley was quiet for a moment, then said that on the south side, almost all of them did. Cora nodded slowly. She said aloud what she had just understood, that this wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't some strange coincidence. If someone controlled a network stretching across half the city, then everything that happened inside that half of the city became their responsibility, even the things whose names they had never heard. Rafe stood up. He said he would have that entire division reviewed that very day. He said that if there had been wrongdoing, he would deal with it. He said he would find Nell Ballard's records, and he would follow the matter all the way to the end. He said every one of those things in the voice of a man accustomed to solving problems by giving orders, and he meant every word. Cora listened to all of it. Then she closed the file and pushed it back toward him. She said, "You didn't target my sister. You had never even heard her name. I know that. You only built the net, and then you never looked down to see what got caught inside it." She said that where she lived, people couldn't tell the difference between those 2 things, because the result was exactly the same. She said that all week she had been sitting in her own kitchen listening to him talk about his mother, and she had genuinely felt sorry for him. And now she realized that the way he had treated his mother was exactly the way he had treated this entire city. He paid for a system, then turned his back and trusted that meant the job was done. Rafe had nothing to say. Cora lifted her bag onto her shoulder. She said the old woman was still staying with her, and she would stay there for as long as she wanted, and he was welcome to come visit her any time. Then Cora said one final thing. "But don't call me again." She walked out of the room, passed through all 3 doors, took the passenger elevator down instead of the freight elevator, and never looked back once. August Castellano didn't wait long, because he understood perfectly well that from the moment his younger brother learned the truth, everything became a race to see who could file first. He submitted an emergency guardianship petition on Tuesday morning, along with a 3-year notebook rewritten into a thick, typed dossier, every page numbered, complete with appendices, 3 sworn statements from people who had once worked in the house, and a medical report from the doctor whose salary he paid. In that same filing, he included a formal accusation, and in that accusation was the name Cora Ballard, along with the phrase unlawful detention and the phrase financial exploitation of a cognitively impaired elderly person. By afternoon, the first article appeared on a city news site, under a headline about a night shift janitor and a missing elderly heiress, accompanied by a stolen photograph of Cora stepping out through the steel door in the alley behind the Dearborn Street building, her shoulders hunched against the cold, the cloth bag still in her hand. Beneath the article, in the comments, people had already begun writing their own version of the story, and not one of them had ever met her. By the second day, the envelope arrived. It was sitting in the mailbox on the ground floor, thicker than the electric bill, with the name of an agency printed in the upper left corner that anyone who had ever raised a child alone in that building would recognize immediately. Cora carried it upstairs to the 3rd floor, sat on the edge of the chair, and opened it beneath the warm yellow light. She read every word from beginning to end, twice. Then she looked at the large-faced clock on the wall and counted backward to figure out how long she had before the little girl came home. She folded the paper into quarters, pressed every fold flat, put it back inside the envelope, and tucked the envelope beneath everything else in the bottom of the kitchen towel drawer. Then she put a pot on the stove and made dinner the way she did every other night. The old woman sat in the chair beside the window, and it was a foggy day for her, and she asked what they were having for dinner. Cora said soup and bread. She took out the knife and began cutting the loaf into slices, and when the blade had made it halfway through, she had to set it down on the cutting board, place both hands on the edge of the kitchen counter, and stand there without moving until her hands stopped trembling. The old woman didn't see. Out in the hallway came the sound of footsteps running up the stairs, the thump of a backpack hitting the floor, and Bertie pushed through the door, announcing before she was even fully inside that her teacher had put a star on her notebook that day. Cora turned around, smiled, asked what color the star was, and told her to wash her hands and set the table. That same afternoon, downtown, in the lobby of an office building with high ceilings and terrazzo floors, Rafael Castellano stood leaning against a column with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he remained there for about half an hour. He didn't speak to anyone. That morning, an entity under his control had completed the purchase of the entire ownership interest in a small law firm specializing in legal communications, the firm where a young attorney had sold the family file to that newsroom for an amount of money that wasn't very large. By afternoon, the firm had a new board of directors, and the new board had begun reviewing personnel. The elevator doors opened, and the young attorney stepped out carrying a cardboard box filled with his personal belongings, a small potted plant on top, and a framed photograph lying face down beside it. He walked past where Rafe was standing. No one stopped him. No one said a single word to him. Rafe simply watched until the revolving door pushed the man out onto the street. Then he left the lobby through the side entrance. The power went out on a Friday night, not just in the building but across the whole neighborhood. And Cora knew that because when she stepped onto the balcony, the row of buildings across the street was dark too, with only the headlights of passing cars sweeping across the walls. In the darkness, she heard doors clicking open on different floors, people calling to one another. Someone downstairs saying the breaker box outside had burned out again. Then she heard something else. In this building, when the power went out, people went down, but there were footsteps coming up, and they didn't stop at any floor, and there were no voices with them. Cora stood perfectly still in the middle of the kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the table. She could hear the footsteps through the crack around the door, steady and slow, and she counted at least 2 people. Then a flashlight beam swept across the gap beneath the apartment door, moving from right to left, and stopped. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She reached for her phone and typed a message to Ada on the 2nd floor, just 2 words, and almost immediately there came a soft knock at the door, in the exact rhythm the 2 women had used to call for each other for years. Ada came in carrying a large flashlight, and one look at Cora told her everything. Then she turned toward the back of the apartment, and her voice changed completely, lifting into something bright and cheerful. the voice of a woman who had raised 3 children and knew exactly what to say. She called out that she needed to know if anyone wanted to go on an adventure, because the whole building was pitch dark, and she needed an excellent guide. Bertie came running out from the other room. Ada wrapped a blanket around the little girl's shoulders like a cape, pulled a red knit cap onto her head, and placed the big flashlight in both her hands. Then she told Bertie that the most important job was counting the floors, counting them out loud, and not getting a single one wrong, because if she miscounted, the whole expedition would get lost. Bertie held the flashlight with both hands and went first, aiming the beam straight down at the stairs, and she began counting from the very first landing, counting loudly, her voice echoing through the concrete stairwell. Ada walked right behind her, one hand resting on the little girl's shoulder, praising her as they went, and saying their guide was doing a fine job keeping the light on the steps. Cora came last with the old woman, one hand supporting her elbow, and the other gripping the railing. The whole group moved down slowly. Between the second and first floor landing, Bertie lost count of the steps and burst out laughing, then insisted they start over from the beginning. And Ada said, "Of course, whatever the guide says, that's what we do." Near the second floor landing, Cora heard something above them in the upper stairwell. A brief sound. Then nothing. The little girl didn't hear it because she was counting loudly and laughing at the echo of her own voice bouncing back from all 4 walls. Ada didn't turn around. She only slowed by half a step so Cora could catch up, and in an ordinary voice, she said to remember to tell the guide to keep the flashlight pointed at the stairs instead of the ceiling. By the time they reached the ground floor, the lobby was full of people. There were candles, several flashlights, and someone from one of the apartments had even brought down a whole pot of tea. Bertie ran over to tell the other children that she had just guided an entire expedition down all the dark stairs and had only counted wrong once. The old woman was settled into a plastic chair near the entrance with a blanket wrapped around her, and one of the neighbors sat down beside her and asked whether she wanted some tea. The power came back after about 2 hours. The next morning, when Cora opened the door to take out the trash, there was a folded piece of paper tucked into the doorframe, handwritten, unsigned, with only one line on it. It said that 2 men had made it up to the second floor landing the night before and changed their minds there, and that from now on, someone would be sitting in the car parked at the end of the street every night. Cora finished reading it, folded the note again, and slipped it into her pocket beside the yellow notice. The hearing was scheduled for the end of the month, and Arthur Penhall, the lawyer who had worked for the Castellano family since Salvatore's time, called Cora into his office to prepare her testimony. He handed her a set of copies from the transfer records the court had ordered produced, and told her to read them carefully, because she was the only person who had actually seen the old woman in that condition. Cora turned the pages one by one. When she reached page 6, she stopped. It was a transfer authorization form, a standard printed document with a box for the receiving facility, a box for the reason for transfer, and at the bottom, a line for the signature of a family member or legal representative. All week, everyone had been saying Camille Ashworth was the person who signed that paper. Camille herself had admitted, in a perfectly casual voice, that she had signed some documents while Rafe was away, because the doctor said the old woman needed to be moved somewhere quieter. But the signature on this copy wasn't Camille's. Cora had seen Camille sign the meeting record the day before, rounded letters, even strokes, with a line underneath. The signature on this form trembled, leaned to the right, and the final stroke stretched out before fading away, as though the person writing it had run out of breath at the very end. Cora had seen that handwriting once before, across the edge of the envelope containing the will inside the tin box, where the signature ran across the sealed flap. She asked Penhall to obtain the original. The original arrived 3 days later, and on the original, besides the signature, there was something else the photocopy had failed to show clearly. Beneath the signature line, in the blank space reserved for notes, several tiny words had been written in the same hand, squeezed between 2 printed lines. She had written, "I am doing this voluntarily. No one is forcing me, and I understand what I am doing." Rafe came to Penhall's office that afternoon. He picked up the paper and read it. And he read it for a very long time, considering how few words were on the page. Penhall began to explain that according to the records, about a week before the signing there had been a meeting at the house, that August had brought over a set of documents requiring her signature under the pretense of restructuring the family trust, that she had signed part of them and asked to postpone the rest because she was tired, and that another meeting had been scheduled for the following week. That next meeting never happened, because before it could, she was no longer in that house. Rafe set the paper down. He didn't ask Penhall another question. He simply sat in the leather chair across from the desk and stared into the empty space between his hands. And inside his mind, everything rearranged itself into a completely different order. His mother had stood in her oldest son's office with 3 years of notes in her hands. She had understood that as long as she remained in that house, another set of documents would be placed in front of her every week. And there would be weeks when she was clear, and weeks when she wasn't, and all anyone had to do was wait for one of the weeks when she wasn't. She knew she couldn't fight by speaking, because from the moment people knew she forgot things, they stopped hearing her words as testimony. She couldn't call the younger son, because the younger son was busy, and because the younger son would pick up the phone and call his brother. She couldn't run to someone else's house, because she no longer knew anyone in that neighborhood. The only thing she still controlled was her own hand. So when they placed that transfer form in front of her, the paper that would take her out of the city and beyond the reach of those documents, she had picked up the pen. She had signed it herself. She had added those few words in the empty space, so that if someone read it later, they would know she had been lucid, that she had understood, that no one had forced her. Then she climbed into that white vehicle carrying a small cloth bag, and at the first stop she stepped out on her own, because she had never intended to reach that facility at all. She only needed to get out of that house, and she had exactly one chance. She took 3 trains to return to the building where her mother had once cleaned the hallways, the building where she had hidden the tin box on the night she closed that notebook and put it back into the drawer. She had calculated almost everything correctly. She had miscalculated only one thing, her own strength, and she had fallen on the final stretch, less than 200 steps from where she was trying to go, onto a steel bench in the cold, to wait. Rafe stood up from the chair and took 2 steps before stopping in the middle of the room. He reached out with one hand and gripped the edge of the conference table, then lowered himself right there onto the carpet in the middle of the office, his back against the table leg, his head bowed. Penhall closed the door and stepped outside, because his mother hadn't been abandoned by anyone. She had surrendered herself to the cold. She had paid with the last lucid weeks of her life to buy him time he hadn't even known she was giving him. On the morning of the hearing, the old woman was taken to the courthouse in Penhall's car, and because the proceedings ran longer than expected, the judge called a recess midway through the morning and instructed everyone to return in 40 minutes. The old woman was taken downstairs to the waiting room reserved for elderly visitors on the ground floor, a room with padded chairs, water, and a court employee stationed there. Cora went across the street to buy her a cup of weak tea, and when she came back, the waiting room was empty. The attendant said 2 medical workers in white coats had arrived carrying stamped paperwork, said the patient needed to be taken for a medical examination at the request of the petitioner, and promised they would have her back in time. Cora ran into the hallway, ran down toward the rear exit, and she was just in time to see the back of a white vehicle turning out through the side gate, the same kind of vehicle she had seen on the security footage at the interstate stop weeks earlier. She called Wesley while she was still running. The black SUV picked her up at the corner less than 2 minutes later, and Rafe was already inside, phone pressed to his ear, reading a license plate number to someone on the other end. The white vehicle was heading southeast toward the Beltway, toward the state line, and it was driving exactly at the speed limit, never passing, never changing lanes sharply, because whoever was inside knew that once they crossed the state boundary, every court order issued here would lose its force, and everything would have to begin again in another jurisdiction. A place where August had connections and Rafe did not. Wesley didn't chase them. He made 2 phone calls, and at the 3rd toll lane of the final plaza before the state line, a truck hauling construction materials suddenly broke down across the lane, forcing all the remaining traffic to compress behind it. The white vehicle became trapped in the middle of the jam, unable to reverse, unable to turn away. A light rain was falling, the last cold rain of winter, making the concrete shine beneath the yellow lamps of the toll canopy. Rafe got out first. Cora stepped out right behind him, and from a black sedan stopped in the neighboring lane. August emerged as well, wearing a cashmere sweater, carrying no umbrella, and stood there watching his younger brother approach. The 2 brothers faced each other on the wet concrete, about 3 paces apart. August spoke first. He said Rafe was ruining everything, that their mother was being taken for a lawful medical evaluation, that all the paperwork was in order, that he was interfering with a medical procedure. He said it in the calm voice of an older brother who had spent 40 years speaking that way to a younger brother 9 years his junior. Rafe said nothing. He only looked at August's hand, at the close-trimmed, spotless nails, at the hand that had held a pen night after night for 3 years, recording every time their mother forgot something. Then he punched him. Once, August staggered backward 2 steps and caught himself against the hood of the car beside him, and he didn't straighten up again. Rafe didn't move forward either. He remained exactly where he was, his fist still clenched, his chest rising and falling, while the entire toll plaza seemed to contain nothing but the sound of rain striking the metal roof and the idling engines of dozens of trapped vehicles. Then came the sound of a sliding door opening. Cora had managed to pull open the side door of the white vehicle. Inside, the old woman was sitting on a folding seat, wearing her cardigan buttoned all the way up, both hands resting neatly in her lap. A thin blanket spread across her knees. She was looking outside. She had seen everything. She looked at her older son bracing himself against the hood of a car, looked at her younger son standing in the rain with his fist still closed, and there was no alarm in her face, no fear, nothing but a deeply familiar weariness, the expression of a mother who had watched this scene far too many times in her life. In a perfectly calm voice, she asked whether the two of them were fighting again. Then she let out a breath and added that they should get into the car before they both got soaked. Rafe opened his hand. August lifted his head and looked at his mother. And in that moment, everything he had spent 3 years building, the numbered dossier, the sworn statements, the newspaper stories, all of it suddenly had no place left on that rain-slick concrete. He turned away, walked back toward the black sedan, and no one stopped him. Cora climbed into the vehicle, sat down beside the old woman, took off her own coat, and laid it over her legs, exactly as she had done on the floor of the subway station that very first night. The hearing resumed the following week, and both sides knew that everything would be decided by the memory card sitting inside the court's evidence box, the card Penhall had submitted along with the tin box, the card no one in the room knew the contents of, because procedure required that it be opened only during the hearing. The technician inserted it into the computer. The screen projected onto the white wall behind the judge's bench lit up and displayed a folder, and the folder was empty. The technician tried a second time, then a third, then bent down and whispered to the court clerk that the device was functioning properly, but the data had been overwritten. A murmur moved through the room. August's attorney closed the file in front of him, leaned back in his chair, and a very thin smile appeared on his face. The smile of a man who had just heard a door close at exactly the moment he needed it to. He stood and said that his client had repeatedly maintained that no such evidence had ever existed, and that the other side was wasting the court's time with old boxes and sentimental stories. Penhall rose and asked for more time. The judge looked at the clock on the wall, and it was at that moment that Cora raised her hand and asked permission to speak. Permission was granted, and she stood in the nicest clothes she owned, both hands resting on the back of the chair in front of her, because she needed something to hold on to. She said she didn't understand anything about memory cards and didn't understand anything about the law, but she had been living with Rosalind Castellano in a one-bedroom apartment for several months now, and there was something she wanted to tell them. She said that beginning in the second week, she started noticing things disappearing around the apartment. Teaspoons vanished one by one, cookies disappeared from the tin, but there were no crumbs anywhere. Once, even the photograph she had taped to the refrigerator went missing. She said that at first she thought the old woman had dropped things somewhere and forgotten, and that seemed normal. Then one day she washed the cloth doll her little niece had given Rosalind, the doll the child had sewn herself in craft class, and Cora noticed that it felt strangely heavy. She opened the stitching, and inside she found 3 spoons, a handful of crushed cookies, and the photograph. She said she had asked Rosalind about it, and Rosalind answered with a sentence Cora had never forgotten, that when she was a girl, her mother used to hide her wages inside Rosalind's doll when she came home from work, because there was someone in the house back then who liked going through wallets, and nobody ever thought to search a child's toy. Cora said Rosalind hadn't been plotting anything at all. She had only been doing something her hands had learned to do when she was still a little girl, sleeping in an armchair in the waiting room of the Dearborn Street building, something the deepest part of her memory still remembered even after everything else had begun to fall away. Then Cora said that not long ago, she had picked up the doll to mend one of its legs and discovered that the seam down its back had already been opened and sewn shut again, stitched with blue thread even though the entire doll had originally been sewn with white thread, and Cora knew for certain she hadn't done it, while the little girl at home didn't know how to sew. Penhall asked permission to submit an additional piece of evidence. The cloth doll was placed on the clerk's table, and beside it were a spool of blue thread and the needle still stuck into the spool, both taken from a drawer in the third-floor apartment. The seam was opened there in court. Inside the stuffing was a memory card wrapped in a piece of aluminum foil and secured with a rubber band that had gone brittle, exactly like the one that had been submitted before. It was inserted into the computer, and the white wall behind the judge's bench lit up. Everything that followed happened very quickly, far more quickly than everything that had led to it. The emergency guardianship petition was denied in full. The 3-year dossier was turned over to investigators, along with the prescription records of the doctor on the family payroll. And before spring had time to arrive, August Castellano was indicted on 3 charges, including falsifying documents and elder abuse, while the Ashworth family quietly withdrew all of its investments from the city and ended the engagement with a statement exactly 2 lines long. As they left the courtroom, the old woman held Cora's hand and asked whether the doll would be given back to the little girl, because it belonged to the child, not to her. Renwick lay 3.5 hours southeast of the city by car, a steel town whose furnaces had gone cold long ago, with 7 storefronts along Main Street and 4 of them boarded shut. And at the corner of Wheeler Street there was a small commercial space where the rotting wooden sign still showed half of the first word from the old name. Rafe bought it, along with the land behind it that sloped gently upward toward the foot of the hill. And there he built a 1-story wooden house with a wide porch facing west. But that wasn't the price he paid. The price came over the next 3 months, when he called Wesley in and told him to pull the entire emergency services division on the south side out of that trust. Not sell it, not transfer it, not hand it to anyone else, but dismantle it. Wesley told him plainly that doing so would cost an enormous amount of money, and losing the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that when a man like Rafe dismantled one of his own operations, the whole city would understand that he was weakening, and someone would test him. Rafe said he knew. He opened all the routing data from the previous several years and turned it over to an independent oversight board, and he sat through 3 full sessions answering every question that no one had ever dared ask him before. The Bridgeport dispatch network was restructured. The allocation criteria based on what they called data were eliminated, and the board began reviewing old complaints that had never received an answer. The first case reopened bore the name Nell Ballard. Rafe didn't call Cora to tell her. He didn't offer a word of apology, before or after. She learned about it through a letter from the board mailed to the 3rd-floor apartment, stamped and official, inviting her to appear as next of kin, and she sat for a very long time on the edge of the chair, with that letter in her hands, before finally getting up to put a pot on the stove. That summer, the whole household moved to Renwick. The old woman had a room of her own overlooking the hill, with a wicker chair on the porch, and every morning before dawn she was already awake, because the clock inside her body had been running that way for 40 years and refused to change. Rafe began waking with her. He went down to the kitchen first, turned on the light, put water on to boil, and began relearning from the beginning everything a little boy had once known and then forgotten. She taught him how to sift flour. She complained that his hands were too heavy. She told him he kneaded as though he were fighting with the dough, and dough had never fought with anyone in its life. One morning, after he had finished kneading and stood staring impatiently at the lump of dough in the bowl because it wasn't moving, she put a hand on his shoulder and told him, "You can't force it. You can only stay here with it." Then she pulled up a chair beside the bowl and sat there with him until the dough rose. Bertie was given the best job of all. She stood on a stool pulled close to the table, both arms covered in flour up to the elbows, kneading with tremendous enthusiasm and singing as she worked. And every time the old woman praised her, she kneaded a little harder. Rosalind taught her how to press down with the heel of her hand and fold the dough back over itself, how to dust the table with flour so it wouldn't stick, and how whoever made a loaf had to mark the top themselves so they would know which one was theirs after baking. Bertie drew a star. Every day, she drew a star. Cora often stood in the kitchen doorway watching the 2 of them, a towel still in her hand, and some mornings she remained there longer than she needed to. The old woman weakened very slowly, so slowly that no one in the house noticed, until everything gathered itself into a single morning near the end of summer. The air had begun to turn cool by then. Dew still clung to the grass on the hill, and she woke early as always, came downstairs, and tied on her apron. Rafe was sifting flour. Bertie was climbing onto the stool. Cora was pouring weak tea into a cup. The old woman dipped her hands into the bowl and began to knead, then stopped and sat down in the chair beside the table, both hands still dusted with flour resting in her lap. She said that today she would just sit and watch. Then she looked at each of them in turn. She looked at her youngest son, and called him by the little name she had given him when he was 4 years old. She looked at the child standing on the stool and said, "Bertie," clearly and perfectly, without confusing the name, without searching for the word. Then she looked at the woman holding the teapot, and she didn't call her Delia. She called her Cora. She said, "Make sure you let the dough rest long enough." Then she leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes like someone who had just finished a very long shift. Outside, the sun had just risen beyond the ridge, and the light spilled through the kitchen window in a long stripe across the tile floor. And inside that kitchen, no one said anything for a very long time. Rafe was the first to move. He knelt beside the chair, took his mother's flour-covered hands in his own, and held them there. Cora lifted Bertie down from the stool and carried her out to the porch, pointed to the dew disappearing from the grass, and told her that Grandma was tired and had gone to sleep, and the two of them sat outside together until the sun climbed high into the sky. The building on Dearborn Street changed ownership in the spring of the following year, and it took nearly a year to renovate it, removing all the stone reception desks, lowering the ceilings, widening the windows, replacing every cold white light with warm yellow ones, and hanging a large-faced clock in every hallway with a handwritten note beneath it, saying what day of the week it was. The place was named Delia House. It was a care center for elderly people gradually losing their memory, and it accepted people with no known relatives as well, the cases other facilities were accustomed to calling transfers. Cora became the executive director, and in the hiring policy she wrote herself. There were 2 lines the board questioned again and again, asking whether they were truly necessary. Preference would be given to people who had worked night shifts in the cleaning industry, and to people who had left nursing school for financial reasons. Cora kept both lines exactly as they were. In the lobby, in a place where everyone who walked through the door could see it, a glass frame hung on the wall, and inside it was a moss-green cloth-bound notebook with all 4 corners worn bare, open to the first page, where hand-drawn columns recorded the time each shift began, the time it ended, the number of floors cleaned, and the wages earned, first written in pencil and then traced over in ink. Cora finished the rest of her nursing program in the evenings, and she received her degree at the age of 31, sitting in the very last row at graduation because she still had to make it back in time for her shift. One afternoon, while reviewing the employee list from a cleaning company bidding for the building contract, she scanned the column of names assigned to the night shift and stopped at one she recognized. She looked at that name for a while. Then she approved the entire list without changing anything, without going to see anyone, closed the file, and went into the next room to check whether dinner had been served. In Renwick, the bakery reopened on an early autumn morning, and the new wooden sign carried exactly the same name the old one had borne. Then, early one winter morning, when Cora went down to Lower Wacker Station for the handover of a cleaning contract, she passed the last row of benches and saw an elderly man sitting there, his back bent, a cloth bag held against his body, his eyes fixed on the tunnel where the trains emerged, waiting for someone she knew would never come. This time, she wasn't alone. She made one phone call, and while she waited, she took off her coat and laid it over the old man's legs. Rafe and Cora were married the following summer in the backyard of the bakery, with only about 20 people there, including Ada Fontaine in a new dress, crying from beginning to end. Wesley Corrigan standing at the far end of the yard watching the cars, and several of the old neighbors from Renwick. Bertie walked ahead carrying a small basket, and instead of flowers, she scattered flour, scattering it so generously that the entire path turned white, and everyone who walked across it left footprints behind. No one told her to use less. There are people who pass through our lives whom society has grown accustomed to looking straight through. The person mopping floors at midnight, the elderly person who can no longer remember what day of the week it is, and sometimes the only thing they need isn't money or medicine, but someone willing to stop, call them by the right name, and sit beside them long enough to hear the whole story. Wealth can buy care, but no one can buy presence, and in the end, what we leave behind for one another isn't what we manage to accumulate, but the moments when we were willing to stop. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories like this one. How did Cora and Rosalind's story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who stopped for you, or have you ever stopped for someone else? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.